Thank you so much, Janine and Superintendent Jordan. I think our debates were friendly debates. They were good debates and discussions, which is what a place to have them too in Berkeley. It's very special for me to be here this morning for a lot of reasons. One, it's a privilege to be in front of you all who really are on the front lines in education, dealing with all the issues that are, really are on the spectrum today that youth face. And I know, having worked in a few different administrations in Washington, the issue with Safe and Drug-Free Schools program was something that I know in DCP we might have had a different opinion than some of our other congressional colleagues who didn't quite see the value. Let me tell you, we did see the value, and we continue to see the value for what you do, even if not everybody in Washington feels the same way. So you should know that you do have supporters in DC, and you have supporters around the country and other colleagues who are standing with you every day in what you do. It's also a privilege for me to be here at Berkeley. I actually graduated from this campus in 2001, and I lived on literally this campus in the next building freshman year, and I haven't really been back to this campus since. And when I got the inquiry from Janine, I just jumped at the opportunity to be here. It really is I feel very privileged, very emotional for me to be back here. At Berkeley, I was involved in a number of things, including dealing with community substance abuse issues, which, I know that this is a very difficult environment to talk and deal with substance abuse and emotional mental health issues. I don't deal with what you deal with every day, so I don't know exactly what you're going through, but being from here and having been in this environment, I know that compared to a lot of other places in the country, all of you are doing amazing work and have your work cut out for you, but you are succeeding. So actually, give yourself a round of applause right now, please. And I normally don't do that when I speak in front of audiences. We get right to the point, but really I feel so honored and privileged to be in front of you. And I'm really excited to talk to you about what I think is one of the most misunderstood issues right now in society for a number of reasons. Cultural being primarily one of them. It's very difficult to have a rational conversation about marijuana. And I'm seeing a lot of heads nod in agreement. I mean, marijuana is connected to so many cultural and historical symbols in this, good and bad, really, in this country and in our past, that it's hard for folks to get past those symbols and simply look at the science, look at the evidence, look at how this affects young people, look at how our policies and our environmental factors that go into whether somebody chooses to use and what the societal ramifications are for that. It's very difficult to have that conversation. And so today I'm going to go sort of rather quickly. I've lived on the East Coast ever since I graduated, so I'm speaking many more words per minute. And I will apologize in advance, and we have a short amount of time, and I even want to try and take some questions because that's my favorite part. So if I'm going very quickly, one thing you'll know is that everything I'm saying is based on my book that just came out last month, my first book called Reefer Sanity, 7 Great Myths About Marijuana. And so everything from this presentation can be found in that book and fully cited, and if I'm going quickly over a certain concept, again, I apologize, but hopefully it's described more thoroughly there. But I wrote the book because I really was sick of the conversation about marijuana in this country, sort of, this false dichotomy that we've created, I think, this debate. On the one hand, a failed war on drugs and prohibition and locking people up for small amounts of marijuana use, and on the other hand, legalization. And right now, I feel like in this country, we're on a 100-mile-per-hour freight train to a brand new policy of legalization, of which there will be no turning back if it goes wrong. And so before we fully do that, I think we really need to understand the possible consequences and have an informed debate. That's really why I wrote the book and why I'll talk a little bit about the project that I started with former Congressman Patrick Kennedy, who's somebody most people would not think would be caring about the marijuana issue, but as someone in recovery and someone that cares about mental health, has really stepped up to the plate on this. I think it's just important quickly when we look at trends in drug use. Going to go over this very quickly, but you all know this. Marijuana, of all the illicit drugs, marijuana is really by and large, in terms of total number of users, the drug that we're talking about, that kids and other people in society are using. Now, of course, you compare it to our legal drugs, and I think this is an important comparison because we sort of lose track sometimes about the effect of our legal drugs just because they are legal. We know that alcohol is used, for example, by about 52 to 55% on the low end of Americans every month, at least once a month. 27% of Americans, even after every single anti-smoking campaign you could ever imagine, and I don't even know where you can smoke anymore. I mean, right? Including in your own home. I mean, your kids are gonna kick you out, your spouse is gonna kick you out. I don't know where you can do it. But still, 27% of Americans smoke or use tobacco products. 90% of that number use cigarettes. And 7% of Amerians smoke marijuana regularly, right? So this is the national numbers. A fourth, so for every one person that smokes marijuana, 4 smoke cigarettes, and 6 to 7 drink. I think that's important to look at when we think about legality and the normalization and what that does to use levels. So I'm going to get right in here to maybe some of the controversy, but I will tell you, in the scientific community, this issue about marijuana being, this myth that's out there, marijuana being harmless and non-addictive, actually, this is not a controversial topic. I mean, this is, even folks who think that for some legitimate reasons, legalization is the right way to go. And there are I think, some credible reasons for that, even if I don't come down to that ultimate conclusion. It's very hard, it'd be very difficult to find somebody in the scientific community really argue with this. However, it's amazing the disconnect between science and public perception. It's really incredible. So it's important to look at the science and also think about why there's this misperception. So we know that marijuana, like all drugs, including alcohol, most people who use marijuana actually do not have a problem with it. They don't get addicted. That's the same with alcohol. Frankly, it's the same with all psychoactive substances. The issue is it's the small number of those who do get addicted that cause a great amount of problems. So let's think of alcohol for a minute. 85% of drinkers drink responsibly, right? The total number of drinkers. It's the 15% of drinkers that consume 90% of the volume of alcohol, right? So, when you look at the numbers, 8 out of 10 people are doing, what's the big deal? Well, it's the 2 out of 10 that are causing a huge amount of problems. It's the same thing with all other psychoactive substances, including marijuana. Now, the interesting thing about also psychoactive substances, including marijuana, is that it's different in terms of your chances for addiction or having a problem are different if you start young versus when you start older. And this makes a lot of sense, right, if you think about how the brain works. If you want your child to learn a language, you probably want to teach them that language at age 2 or 3 versus at age 20 or 30, right? They're more likely to retain that when they're 2 or 3. Same thing with, when you want to learn to ride a bike or swim, right? You learn as young as you can. You don't wait till you're older. Well, drugs do the exact same thing in terms of affecting the brain in that way. What I mean by that is, when drugs enter the brain and bloodstream at age 15, you're much more likely for that brain to be hijacked by those drugs and an addiction to occur than when you start at age 40, right? Because your brain is not fully developed until age 25. So that's why for young people, all kinds of experiences and memories matter when you're young. They have the ability, and they don't always do that, but they have a greater likelihood of sticking with that child, whatever that is. It could be drug use, it could be a good memory, it could be a traumatic event. Sticking with that child when they're young simply because their brain is still forming, right? It's still priming and pruning and figuring out who it's really going to be for the rest of its life. And it takes up right up until about age 25. In fact, if we looked at the alcohol age of use and we based it on science, not an arbitrary number, we'd be basing it on 25 when we think about how the brain is working. And so in terms of the implications for society, in terms of why there are these misperceptions, I think that the vast majority of people, we all know, I think everyone in here and everywhere that I go, myself included, we know plenty of successful folks that either smoked marijuana or maybe continue to smoke marijuana. And a lot of people say, well, my neighbor does it and they're fine, and really it's been demonized, what's the big deal? Well, we're not quite seeing then that 1 in 6 teens that become affected. We're really seeing the vast majority of people that aren't. And so what I think a lot of people do, we generalize based on our own experiences what the effects will be. And I think that's really a mistake. I think we need to really look at the evidence and look at the data and how it's affecting others. I'm going to go through this very quickly. It won't be a surprise to many of you that for not only adolescents, but for the general population, marijuana is the #1 reason why both people are referred to treatment from the criminal justice system, but also self-report to treatment and also get reported to treatment from school. It trumps all the other substances. really because the number of users. And the question, the inevitable next question is, well, how does this compare to other drugs, right? I mean, this drug is worse, this drug is better, what's worse, are they substitutes? We hear that a lot. Well, when you look at the adolescent really risk of addiction versus the different substances, yeah, there are definite differences. In fact, tobacco and cocaine, definitely, and also followed by heroin, are the 3 top most addictive substances for a young person. By the way, for an adult, it's tobacco beats heroin by far. But for an adolescent, it's tobacco, heroin, and cocaine. And then we get to really marijuana, stimulants, and alcohol kind of vying for 4th place in terms of what is sort of the chances of addiction based on using the substance once. So yeah, it's important not to use scare tactics, not to overstate the case, which I think has been done, and so we lose some credibility. But I think still 1 in 6, which is 15%, at least for adults, should give us plenty to worry about, really, when we think about the chances for kids. I get students who come up to me after I show them this slide, and they say, well, Kevin, I'm part of the 5 out of 6 that, doesn't get addicted, and really, what's the chances 1 out of 6? I mean, that's so remote, and, I'm sure I'll be part of the 5 out of 6, or my friends are. And then I ask them, well, would you ever drink and drive? And the answer is, well, of course not, I'm glad they answered that. Obviously, that reflects a societal norm now, which is good. But then I say, well, what do you think the chances are of getting into a fatal car crash if you're drunk? And usually the answer is 70% chance, like 7 out of 10, or 1 out of 2, maybe 1 out of 3. Well, they're shocked when they hear the actual statistic, which is 1 in 300. Now, we don't go around saying, well, there's 299 times out of 300 that if you're drunk, you won't get into a fatal car crash, so, roll the dice. We laugh at that. But for some reason, with marijuana, because I think of its cultural significance and the way, again, most of us maybe have people who, again, fall in that 5 out of 6 category, it's easily discounted by kids. When I talk to parents and folks in, 60s and 70s, I hear a lot, well, we smoked all throughout, these very dorms, Kevin, come on, what's the problem? These are successful people. I was in a debate once where the guy said, marijuana is a gateway. It's a gateway to the White House, because every president's used. Right. So, okay, well, yeah, most people, again, who use won't get into trouble. Okay, let's not overstate the case. We don't need, that's why my book wasn't called Reefer Madness. But when we talk about why there seem to be increased consequences, so I think when we use the word growing, it actually does make sense. Because when we think about the increased consequences today versus the consequences of use from 30 years ago, there is a marked difference. And it's important to ask, well, why is there that difference? One reason a lot of scientists think there's that difference is because the strength and potency of marijuana has increased 5 to 6-fold from the 1960s and 70s. In other words, when we track the level of THC, remember, marijuana has 500 ingredients in it, actually 2,000 when you heat it up, but 500 in the natural plant. THC is the one ingredient that gets you high. That's the psychoactive ingredient. And when we look at the THC levels from the 1960s, about 0 to 1, didn't even get up to 2% until really the 80s, which is amazing, average marijuana potency. And then you fast forward to today, well, we're looking from 1 to 2% to about 14 to 15% average. And I'll tell you, in the dorms when even in the late 90s here, 14% THC wasn't even that good. I mean, this is the average. This is like taking into account, Oklahoma and, places not exactly known for their marijuana cultivation. But, the average 14%. Now, what's also interesting is, well, what about the other ingredients in marijuana? Because there are others. We don't know about 98% of those other ingredients. But one other one that we do know about is called CBD. CBD actually doesn't get you high. In fact, if you have a marijuana blunt or cigarette with THC and a lot of CBD in it, it's going to take away the high. In other words, growers don't want marijuana with CBD in it because it doesn't get you high. Well, I was interested in, when I was at the White House, looking at the numbers for CBD. Well, CBD has been almost bred out of modern marijuana. So when I go into discussions or debates and people say, well, 3,000 years ago, the Sumerian hieroglyphics show that cannabis was used in a certain society or, a Chinese society. Yeah, that's great, but, it is not comparable to the marijuana today. In fact, like to tell my parents and their friends that the marijuana they smoked was, equivalent of if we went over to Whole Foods and smoked the cardboard of the hemp waffles today. The resin that kind of compared really to the marijuana of today. It is totally a different drug. 14% THC in the 60s was called something else. It was called hashish. Right? It was, it was a totally different substance. Now, well, what does that mean in terms of consequences? Well, it's interesting because although the number of marijuana users is the same now from about 20 years ago, relatively the same. It's gone up and down, but overall use is the same. There were only about 16,000 emergency room admissions in the late 80s and early 90s for marijuana out of the millions of users of use. So it was relatively low. Well, with that number staying constant of the number of users, what's interesting is that 16,000 ER admissions has actually gone up to almost 400,000. So same number of users, 20 times as many people, usually for something like an acute panic attack or psychotic episode from an inexperienced user, really, right? Inhaling something that they've never done before and they have an adverse reaction. I have a story in the book about a guy who was the spokesperson for legalization in the state of Texas in the 70s. And he left that job and stopped smoking for 30 years. He's from this area. He smoked for the first time under the auspices of medicine in the early 2000s. And he had a marijuana brownie is what he had, or a muffin. And he did have to go to the emergency room. I mean, this is a guy who hadn't done this in 20 years, couldn't believe the difference in terms of the potency and how much it's changed. We know that it affects parts of the brain in terms of memory, attention, and reaction time, and that has implications, I think, for education that we need to remember. We know that the connection to mental illness is very strong, and people say, well, chicken before the egg. What's mental illness? Does that cause marijuana, or is it somebody has mental illness and then that's why they self-medicate with marijuana? It makes them feel better. The answer is it doesn't really matter because it's probably both in both directions. The point is it exacerbates existing symptoms, and there's evidence for causing the onset of new symptoms. And this is why someone like Patrick Kennedy and the National Alliance for Mental Illness, this is not a controversial position to say that probably more marijuana is not good for society, and we have to think about how our policies affect that. We don't need to dwell on the fact that we know marijuana is an irritant to the lungs. There isn't this sort of smoking gun on cancer yet. It's not really there. Honestly, the evidence is mixed. We're still learning about cancer. We do know you inhale more carcinogenic compounds, but we don't see the cancer rates as we do in tobacco smokers, so scientists are still looking at that link. If there was one scientific finding over the last 20 years for marijuana that I would highlight, that if you remembered one thing out of myth one, this is what I would ask you to remember, and it has implications for what you all do every day, probably more than any other audience I speak to. And that is the unbelievable study that came out last year, which is a study of 1,000 people in the third largest city in New Zealand. And it's a researcher's dream. It's a longitudinal study where they get to study everybody born in this city in the year 1970 and 1971. And they check in on them for a bunch of different issues every 5 to 8 years. Well, the last time they checked in on them, they decided to ask about marijuana and look at educational attainment and look at IQ. And essentially what they found, to make a very long story short, controlling for everything else, where they went to school, their level of education, parenting, alcohol use, other drug use, etc., they found that regular persistent marijuana smokers as teens, in other words, 3 to 4 times a week for 3 to 4 years of their teenage life, even if they stopped at age 21, showed a 6 to 8 point average IQ loss relative to the group controlling for everything else that were not regular marijuana smokers. Now, when I first heard that and started talking to student audiences about that, sometimes the reaction is, well, what's an IQ level? I mean, it's like, is that an SAT thing? Is it, ACT? How's that going to affect my chances of getting into college? That's always the question. The answer is 8 points is enough to take you from the top third of the global average for IQ to the bottom third. Furthermore, for an audience like this and educators and teachers, let's think about this a little bit, let's stretch this out a little bit. Who gets blamed when students do poorly on exams? Right. The parents? No. No, you do. That's exactly right. And so if IQs are going down and teachers are getting blamed, this is an issue. This isn't an issue about, the sort of scare tactics, etc. But if there's lower, because you're, for better or worse, you are graded on the performance of your students. If their performance is going down because of memory and other issues related to IQ, that becomes an issue. Now, again, that doesn't happen to everybody. I mean, the rebuttal is, well, I know this genius who started a .com and he smokes, or I know this person. Yeah, that's great, but the point is you're playing roulette. You're gambling. And so the question to students is, yeah, you may get away with it. A lot of people do. But you're taking a gamble, and it's up to you whether you think, you just need to know the statistics and the science. It's up to you whether or not you should take that gamble. We know the link with dropping out of school, unemployment, etc., the link in the workplace with absences and tardies. I'm not going to go into great detail. Now I want to talk about the issue that here, when I was in school here in 1996, 97, certainly this issue of medical marijuana, which has really gained prominence over the last 20 years. When I'm asked in an elevator if marijuana is medicine, the answer is yes. Marijuana contains medical properties. But we don't need to smoke marijuana to get those properties, period. Now that's the elevator answer. And let's think about opium for a minute. We don't smoke opium to get the effect of morphine, right? We have, thank God, science has moved on. We have a standardized medication, you can get it from a doctor. But now, for some reason, again, marijuana, I talk about this in the book, is the exception because of a lot of cultural and other reasons. We have decided to set up a totally separate system for a plant that has medicinal properties, but we've just chosen to treat it differently. What do I mean by differently? Well, we're essentially saying, all right, you have, a debilitating illness. Don't talk to your doctor about it, about marijuana. Don't go to your pharmacy that you normally go to. And I'm not sure how it's going to interact with the other drugs you're taking. Oh, and by the way, the stuff you get in this county is going to be a little different than the stuff in that county. And I can't really, it's not like Advil, where I had an Advil the other day and I knew it was the same Advil I get in Cambridge, Mass, where I live, versus the same Advil I get here. They're standardized. So essentially what we're saying to somebody is, again, don't go to the pharmacy, don't go to your doctor, don't do that. Instead, I want you to go to that part of town that you may not have, hung out in before, right? Go around the corner where the strip mall is. You're gonna see a neon sign with a green cross and bars on the window and a sign that says cash only. You're also gonna see a sign that says rent a doc, $200 free, not free, $200 consultation. You're gonna go past the 300-pound bouncer, and if you get past him, then you're gonna see the doctor who's gonna assess you for 5 minutes, see if you've had a backache in the last 10 years. If you have, you will qualify. And then you're gonna go to a guy with no medical experience, 27-year-old kid named Lenny, and he's gonna give you something called Jack the Ripper Green Crack Super Silver Haze. Now, I don't think that's compassionate. I mean, and we laugh, and it's turned into it is a joke now. I mean, even the advocates say, yeah, okay, well, we know that the vast majority of people don't have cancer and HIV, which is the way it was sold. But actually, what I would say to the folks that do have that find relief, and I believe some do, we got to do better than that scenario. I think we can definitely do better. So, the answer is nuanced. Smoked, eaten marijuana hasn't been approved by the FDA. If there's no product, you can't standardize that. However, there are components of marijuana that have medicinal properties. We need to develop those components. And really, the most interesting answer is maybe. Research is ongoing. Of course, you could tell I'm from Berkeley. We need more research, but we do. More research on it because it's something that we don't know a lot about. Right now, we know that there's a pill called Marinol, but we know that Marinol is only based on one ingredient in marijuana, THC. There are hundreds of ingredients. Remember the other ingredient I talked about earlier, CBD? Well, right now, there's a medication going through the system in the FDA, been approved in 20 countries, no adverse side effects, and it's essentially a liquid mouth spray, high in THC, but also CBD. It doesn't get you high. You get it from a pharmacy, you know what's in it. It doesn't have a mold, it wasn't grown by somebody who's also dealing with other drugs. It's actually standardized and you know what you're getting. And I don't work for the federal government anymore, so I can be a little more critical. It's taken too long, and we need to push the FDA and other regulatory bodies to approve these substances because we know they can be helpful for people. As much as I joke about the average person who gets marijuana, which, by the way, we know the average person looks a lot more like this guy than this woman. Right, the studies show that 98% of people in California are under, in their 30s and 40s, that the average user is a 32-year-old white male with back pain, or headaches, or insomnia, or stress. Who qualified? I definitely qualified. As much as that has turned into a little bit of a joke, for the less than 2% of people that frankly say, look, I've tried everything else and this does help, the 200 seizures I have a day when I take a CBD marijuana liquid, that did reduce those seizures. When I have cancer, nausea, pain, and I can't keep down pills, marijuana in a certain oil form that I was lucky enough to find at this place down the street that I trust the guy, that did help. Well, for those people, I think we can do a lot better. We do need to provide them, with something before even those drugs get approved. But I don't think our choices should be Lenny with super silver haze and the 300-pound bouncer at the strip mall, or don't talk about it, it doesn't have medical properties, you just want to legalize marijuana, go away. And again, that's been the way it's been set up. Now, in the meantime, kids are, of course, getting the idea that smoking a joint is actually okay. Right? It's medicine, and it's helping people. How could it ever be harmful? Well, and we know the effect of what that has been. I mean, we know that since medical marijuana, not so much since the laws passed, but since you have what we call point of sales, retail outlets that bombard kids with advertisement about their marijuana, medical marijuana brownies and candies and sodas and lollipops and cereals and ice creams and oils and on. We know that has increased marijuana use in those states. A recent paper by the RAND, Drug Policy Institute. And not among the users, because we can expect it to go up, more people are using, but among kids, because of that message that it's sending. So I think we can do much better. We also know, by the way, the link, just quickly, with marijuana and driving. Very quick, I want to end with that on this one, which is important, because again, a lot of students that I talk to say, I drive better when I'm high. Have you heard that? You've all heard that. Yeah. Well, I think the answer back to that is, okay, you drive slower, so the question is driving 20 in a 65 safer than driving 100 in a 65? They're probably both pretty unsafe. And the depth perception issues. So the British Medical Journal, really kind of case closed, looked at every single study done on drug driving, reviewed all of them for their data accuracy, et cetera. Anyway, concluded at the end that driving under the influence of marijuana doubled your risk of a car crash. That was the conclusion. Now the retort is, well, but alcohol is 4 times as much. Yeah, also horrible, right? It's sort of like this alcohol marijuana thing. It's like saying my headlight is broken, so instead of fixing my headlight, in order to be consistent, because the headlight's really broken, let's bust the tail light. That's the analogy that's a very similar analogy from what I've been hearing about this. I'm going to go forward more, get to the third myth that countless people are behind bars. I am definitely someone saying that we have too many people behind bars in this country, that incarceration is embarrassing. We have the highest levels. We have 5 times as many people in prison today than any industrialized country. Also 5 times as many as our historical average. There's no doubt we have an incarceration problem in the United States. The issue is legalizing marijuana isn't going to solve that problem. And it's, again, put on as a red herring. Just like we hear we have an education problem, we need more money for education, so then we should legalize marijuana. We have a cancer problem because people aren't getting what they need, we need to legalize marijuana. We have a violence problem, we need to get rid of the cartels, we need to legalize marijuana. I think any product presented as solving all of those complex issues that fits on a bumper sticker, we need to question. And by the way, I question the war on drugs. We need to question that too. But why are we stuck in this dichotomy? I don't understand why we can't do better than either of those two. So this issue of countless people are behind bars, in the Obama administration, we looked at who was behind bars. We're concerned with that. And what we found is that less than 0.3% of people in state prison are there for marijuana possession. Now, we do know some people spend a night in jail if it's in conjunction with something else, so that is something we need to look at. We do know that kids can get a criminal record for an arrest, more difficult in California from what I understand because of the laws here, but in other states that is more of an issue. And I think we need to look at that. You shouldn't have a criminal record, when you're 16, if you have a joint that's going to follow you around for your whole life, that's going to prevent you from getting a job or going to school. Agreed, let's fix that. But legalizing doesn't get us there. And it's really a false promise. So I'm going to move forward quickly, but the fourth myth of, again, the legality of alcohol and tobacco strengthened the case for marijuana legalization. I was in a TV studio recently. I ran into Rosie O'Donnell. And Rosie O'Donnell's had alcoholism throughout her family. She's very passionate against that. She's very, also pro-family and was talking about her kids and everything. And, we had a couple minutes in the hallway and she said, yeah, I agree with you. The medical marijuana thing in my state, meaning California, is a charade. Everybody that I know, has severe back pain all of a sudden. But she also said, but Kevin, alcohol, look what alcohol's done. Look what it's done to my family. Look what it's done to society. And my response was, exactly. Exactly. Why would we ever want to emulate any public health policy based on something that from a public health perspective, maybe not a civil rights perspective, because you're right to drink, but from a public health perspective has been an unmitigated disaster, right? 100,000 people dying of alcohol-related poisonings every year, leading cause of death in multiple categories. And not only that, with the use levels of alcohol and tobacco being much higher than all illegal drugs, this is the kicker. The second bullet here about industry is really why I'm here and what you need to hear from this. It's not so much it's harmful. I can talk to somebody until they're blue in the face about the harms of marijuana. If they don't believe me because they have friends that smoke, they're not going to listen. But this is the issue that people listen to, and that is, why would we want to create another industry like the alcohol and tobacco industries that have for 100 years lived off of people's addiction for their profit? Now, when I talked earlier about the fact that it's 15% of people that consume 90% of the volume of alcohol, guess who the alcohol industry targets for their profits? Does it target the person who drinks a glass of wine every night with dinner? The guy who has a couple beers when he watches the game on the weekend? Frankly, if you're in that category, I hate to break it to you, you're unimportant. Sorry. But if you're part of the 15% of people who binge drink and drink irresponsibly and go down that path, you're very important to the industry because you provide their profits. And really, that is why I chuckle when I see ads, beer ads, which by the way are usually the best ones during the Super Bowl, right? They have the most at stake. When I see enjoy responsibly on the, drink responsibly, enjoy, or I see the sign, the chorus that says, if it's not 21, it's not Miller time yet. I mean, you couldn't have an ad that would increase drinking among people under 21 better than saying if you're not 21, it's not Miller time yet, when kids see that. But when I see enjoy responsibly, I have a big chuckle. If everybody enjoyed responsibly their alcohol in this country, there would be no alcohol ad because there would be no alcohol industry. They don't make money from those people that enjoy responsibly. Taxes today for alcohol are 1/5 of what they were than during the Korean War, adjusted for inflation. Kids usually have to Wikipedia Korean War when I'm talking to them in the audience because they never heard of it, they don't even know where it is. Ancient history to them. 1/5. And let me tell you, when I was in Washington, trying to say that, wait a minute, we're the Office of National Drug Control Policy that actually is supposed to be for illegal drugs. Guess what? Alcohol is an illegal drug. For those under 21, Congress, this isn't our mandate. How far did I get with that? Not too far. Because when you have an industry on K Street, funded better than any other industry there, good luck implementing public health practices. They'll throw you some bones and enjoy responsibly, and here's $100,000 to stop underage drinking. But their bottom line of billions relies on the addictive industry. And so I think in people's minds when it comes to marijuana, they think of the nice guy down the street who smokes a joint once a week. What's the big deal? They think of their quirky uncle who's really fun and likes to smoke once in a while. Not a problem. They think of themselves or their friends in college who smoke regularly and now are successful. No problem there. They don't think of the true implications. The true implications is this. The true implications is a new industry living off of addiction. And so now, let me just tell you something. My second book is looking at the tobacco industry to look at the tactics for 100 years and compare them to the new marijuana industry, because let me tell you, the parallels are all there. Denying the science, questioning the science, funding their own science, funding the ad campaigns, saying this is better than that, so you should do that. They're all there, the parallels. The tobacco industry makes the alcohol industry look like the American Red Cross. Angels. The alcohol industry are angels compared to what the tobacco industry did for 80 years. And we know that because we actually have the documents that the tobacco industry worked on for 80 years. How do we have those documents? Well, in the late 90s, basically people came together and said, wait a minute, tobacco's legal, it kills 600,000 people a year, it's a leading cause of death, it costs us $400 billion. Why the heck do 50 to 40% of Americans still smoke cigarettes? We have to do something about it. And frankly, tobacco was almost prohibited in this country. The deal that was cut was, don't prohibit us, we'll do anything you want. Okay, so the government said, give us your internal papers, write us a check for $30 billion to pay for anti-smoking campaigns and the Truth Campaign, and go somewhere else to advertise to kids. They gladly obliged. They're now in Thailand and Laos with the ads from the 50s that were here talking about how doctors prefer camels. Yeah. Cigarettes or medicine. Hey, wait, where did I hear that one before? They are now with those ads in third world countries and in Africa. So that they've moved on from America in terms of they can't do it. But they still advertise here. 27% of Americans still smoke. But one thing we do know is we have their draft of all of the kinds of things that they talked about from the 70s and 80s. You know, the same people that testified before Congress saying, no, sir, cigarettes are really for only those under 21. Privacy of your own home. Private, you know, it's a silver. Well, by the way, where are we hearing that now again, too? But guess what else they did? They turned right around and wrote memos called the importance of, you know, young people. They wrote memos about youth cigarettes, new concepts, apple flavor, freshness. Young people like sweetness and freshness. They said the executives themselves say we don't smoke the expletive. We just sell it. We reserve that right for the young, poor, black, and the stupid. In their own memos on paper. By the way, before the internet, where you were much less likely to get caught writing that, but they still wrote it, typed it. So when I think about marijuana, I don't think about my friends who like to smoke or my buddies at Berkeley with, God love them, the drum circle on Sproul who, you know, like to smoke a joint every now and then. Or my parents' friends, part of a much larger movement in the 60s and 70s where this was seen as a symbol for anti-establishment and free speech. That's wonderful. Go, great. But that is not 2013 legalization. And sadly, that is now where we're going towards because people have it in their minds. Now, let's also think about this quote about we reserve the right for the young, the black, the poor, and the stupid. Let's go back to our friends in the alcohol industry. Where do folks think alcohol liquor outlets are in our country today? Are we surprised that there are 8 times as many liquor stores in poor communities of color than in upper-class white communities? Well, why would that be? Upper-class white communities have the money, why, right? They have money to spend. Why would you focus on poorer communities of color? Well, it's much easier to focus on vulnerable populations. The 15-year-old kid leaving a school with textbooks from the 60s and it's going home to an unstable family, it's much better for your business model to have 6 liquor stores, 4 of which will gladly sell to that kid on his way home from school, than the kid whose parents will just sweep it under the rug or write the $50,000 check to the Betty Ford Center and send them to Palm Springs for treatment, because they can do that with their funding, with their money. There's a reason why vulnerable populations are targeted. And again, I just don't see why we should expect anything different with any other psychoactive industry. I don't care if we're talking, we happen to be talking about marijuana. We could be in 20 years, if some of the advocates have it their way, talking about cocaine and heroin, but it doesn't matter. The point is, these can be harmful. They're not harmful for everybody. They can be, but you can be sure an industry will increase and maximize that harm, because that is the only way they make money. That is really the bottom line. So my question is really, will big marijuana become the big tobacco? That is really the question that I'm trying to answer right now. And when I look at things like vending machines, I mean, your predecessors working on these issues 40 years ago, blood, sweat, and tears were spent by them getting rid of tobacco vending machines. When's the last time you saw a tobacco vending machine? You beat a billion-dollar industry, which was a huge public health gain. Now we're cool with marijuana vending machines, I guess. And this isn't just like one creative guy who put it down there and, you know, somewhere interesting and no, this machine happens to belong to a $2.5 million company who $2.5 million made in a year where marijuana wasn't even legalized yet. This is a medical marijuana vending machine. God help us when the floodgates open, when it's not about, you know, you have to go to the doctor for the $200 thing. It's just you have to be 21 and you're done. And now we're okay with that. We're okay with the advertising targeting kids. We're okay with the Pop Tarts. These are real. Ring pots and grape sodas that target kids. Now, remember, these were all products designed for medicine. Okay, just tell me what 90-year-old patient dying of cancer would find appealing about a monkey skeleton marijuana character on a soda which is THC and sugar. Hey, let's not fool ourselves. Again, not discounting some people who get relief. Great. Let's do that for them. Let's provide them with whatever they need in their last months of life. That's not the issue. The issue is the vast majority of it is not that. It's a joke, and now we're targeting kids, and we seem to be kind of okay with it. So I think that alcohol and tobacco teach us there is no money in this for anyone other than big marijuana. And that leads really to this fifth myth about the budgets. How many people have heard, if only we could legalize marijuana, we could pay for things like public schools, right? We could pay for healthcare and social programs. Well, let's look at our other legal substances. That's an important analogy, because maybe we can, okay? Well, how do we do with alcohol and tobacco? For every $1 in alcohol and tobacco tax, we spend 10 in social costs. That little thing called the California lottery. Okay. Why was the California lottery passed? Was it passed because we like to play games and scratch things with quarters? And no. It was passed to do what? Fund public education. That's the argument in the state legislature. That's the way it's sold to people when we talk about gambling and things. How's that going? How's that worked out for us? Yeah, not too well. Not too well. And yet, we seem to be saying, well, if we can just tax it, then we can pay for things. How many times do we have to forget that that's not going to work? In fact, even from a law enforcement perspective, I hear, well, at least we wouldn't be spending law enforcement resources. Let's treat it like alcohol. Okay, well, how do we treat alcohol? Nonviolent alcohol-related arrests are responsible for 2.7 million arrests in this country. What is that for? Alcohol's legal. How could you do? Well, driving under the influence, public drunkenness, selling to minors. Those things would all be technically regulated even if marijuana was legal. So that's 3 times as many people as we arrest for marijuana. Now, I'm not proud of that number, 847,000. I'm not proud about the disproportionate impact of arrests in communities of color. I'm not proud of the fact that blacks and whites use drugs at the same rate, or blacks are 3 times more likely to be arrested. Or, frankly, whites commit more crimes, yet there are disproportionate representation of Latinos and blacks in prison. Nothing to be proud of. Something we need to change. But the idea that something like legalization is going to solve that, when I see that alcohol actually contributes to disproportionate impacts with regards to the liquor store issue I talked about earlier, and with regards to the arrests that we see here, that's not a panacea. That's not our answer. Finally, and I want to make sure we take questions, the 6th myth about Portugal and Holland providing successful examples, let's be very clear. Nobody in Europe has legalized drugs. Okay? Now, in Holland, you can get marijuana from a coffee shop since 1976, and essentially, what have they seen? A couple things up and down. Basically, no change in drug use in the beginning. Then when they started opening all these retail sales, 3-fold increase among young people. What's the issue in the Netherlands now? What are they doing now? They're reversing their policies. They've closed hundreds of coffee shops. They classify 15% THC with the equivalent of crack because of the negative impact it's had on their society. This is the Netherlands. This isn't like Texas. And they now are the biggest treatment user in Europe for marijuana. Now, it's gotten easier for people who like to smoke pot to get marijuana. Okay, good. But it's also provided some negative consequences. And the results we're still learning from. Portugal, we've heard rumors that Portugal's legalized marijuana. Well, that's an important thing to try and validate. They haven't done so. They essentially, if you're caught with any amount of drugs, you're sent to a panel of social workers that basically determines whether you need treatment or a fine or whatever. And the results there have been mixed. Actually, youth use has gone up, mainly because of the message. Youth thought that it was legalized, even though nothing was legalized. But the deaths have gone down, maybe because people who are sort of advanced stage heroin addiction have actually been able to, gone treatment instead of jail. That's a good thing. But the results are mixed, and we don't know what the impact would be in the US. The point is there are a lot of myths about how other countries handle drugs. And then finally, the seventh myth, I'm not going to talk about it all today, which is this idea that prevention, and intervention and treatment are doomed to fail, so why try? Now, we know that they're not doomed to fail. We know for every dollar invested in prevention, we get 18 back from health and criminal justice savings. And that really needs to be the message to legislators. But let's look at the policy implications right now. The reason I think educators need to care about this, and parents and others, is because this discussion of what's going to happen now, and this is really, don't make no mistake about it, this discussion of marijuana legalization is something that comes about once every couple of 100 years. And we're living in it now. So this is the discussion our generation will be deciding. I think it's a discussion that totally changes our work environment in terms of if this goes forward, making our work much harder. Really has the potential to overpower our best research, most perfectly executed programs. My example of this, why does Patrick Kennedy, the son of the liberal lion of the Senate, Ted Kennedy, the late Ted Kennedy, someone who's dedicated his life to making sure that mental illness is treated the same as physical illness. He's the one who got Congress to agree to the wild idea that the brain is part of the body. It's crazy, right? That's a controversial idea up until ACA, that the brain is part of the body. And people ask him, Patrick, love what you're doing all this stuff. What's up with the marijuana kick? Why do you care about this so much? And he says, listen, we can construct the best insurance program you could ever imagine. We could get treatment and mental health treatment and other emotional disorder treatment, et cetera, to every kid and everybody in this country. If we live, however, in an environment where another substance, this one happens to be connected to mental illness in actually ways that alcohol and some other drugs are not, but if we happen to open those floodgates and normalize the substance and leave it to market forces to increase addiction, what is our work for then? We're going to be overwhelmed by the demand for services, and we're not going to be able to deal with it. Why wouldn't we prevent that from happening? Can't we learn from the disaster of alcohol? Can't we learn from the tobacco industry who hoodwinked us for 80 years? Can't we learn from the current pharmaceutical industry that's literally addicted thousands of families in certain regions like Appalachia and other parts of this country in ways that will not be corrected for another few hundred years because of the opiate epidemic? Can't we learn from the effects of other addictive behaviors like gambling and how that's affected communities as a whole? Why do we have to go down that path again? Because it will overpower our best efforts to implement ACA, our best efforts to implement mental health parity. This is why. Really, it's an issue that I think has more money and resources than really all the groups in the field combined, and very little opposition, and that's why today we have unprecedented support for marijuana legalization. There has been this false dichotomy out there in society. You're either in favor of locking everybody up and gutting on the Nancy Reagan gravy train of just say no and throwing everybody in jail, or you're in favor of something really enlightened that's been thought out by a lot of smart people called legalization. Which one do you choose? Well, a lot of reasonable people are choosing the latter because they don't want the war on drugs. The point is, again, repeat your broken record, why can't we do better than either of those two alternatives? So after really 50 years of trying, the movement to legalize has done it in Colorado and Washington. We'll be watching closely because California will be in 2016 voting on the same thing. Very interesting, it's not the American Medical Association or the Public Health Association or the teachers or the psychiatrists or social workers who are pushing this on the states. It's the industry that wants to make money off of this. I think that's also something very interesting to think about in terms of who supports all of this. Now, the recent guidance by the Attorney General, he did not, contrary to media reports, endorse legalization. What he did say is we're not going to sue these states for their violation of federal law, which he's still saying violates, unless things happen that we don't like youth drug use goes up or drug driving or advertising. And when I was asked by Congress to testify on this, which was awkward for me. I mean, this is an administration I worked in. This is a Justice Department I respect. Looking at it, trying to be as fair as possible, really I came to the conclusion of, wait a minute, have those things that we are caring about, like youth drug use and driving and ads and all the other things that the Attorney General listed, have they already happened? Maybe we can look and see what's gone on in Colorado post-2009. This is interesting. Colorado, like California, legalized medical marijuana, but did nothing for about 7 years on it. That's what happened here, right? 1996, Prop 215 passed. We didn't see dispensaries in any kind of large form. Bay Area, you had a couple, but in sort of a big form, really until about 2003. Right? It wasn't really implemented until then, which was interesting. Colorado, the same thing. 2001, nothing happened for about 6 or 7 years. Then all of a sudden people thought, wait a minute, we can really make some money. Why don't we do dispensaries? Let's do what we can to make money off of this. We can say it's for medicine and it's great. All of a sudden they had from 1,000 cardholders to 108,000 in a period of a few years. I was looking to see, was there like an increase in fourth stage cancer we should know about among 32-year-old white males? Okay, there was the increase. The number of dispensaries went from 0 to 532. Okay, well that's a peek into what happens when you have point of sales and advertising. Any of you have been to Denver or certain cities, you can't walk down the street without being bombarded by 4 dispensaries around you, people out there, that come to see the Rent-A-Doctor. Well, go to Venice Beach. I mean, you have the, on the boardwalk, right? If any of you have been there, you've seen what that's like. And I thought, well, let's look at what's happened. No one's looked at what's happened in Colorado since '09 because we're all preoccupied with what's going to happen now that they've officially legalized. Well, they've unofficially legalized for the last 3 years. What have the results been? Well, it's interesting. Well, Colorado's now the 5th highest marijuana use state in the nation. Their distribution to minors, in other words, drug-related referrals for high school students testing positive, have gone up about 150%, which is interesting. Test positives for marijuana up 57%. 3/4 of the kids in treatment in Denver self-report to the social worker that they received their marijuana from a medical marijuana dispensary that either they got themselves or their friend or older sibling got. That's a diversion to youth that we're supposed to care about, I thought. By the way, they got it an average of 50 times. I mean, this isn't just like, they got lucky once. 50 times. If Denver were a high school, public high school area, they would have the highest rate of drug use in the country, marijuana use in the country. 30% of high school students in Denver regularly use marijuana. Highest, higher than here, higher than anywhere. Highest in the country. Denver's always had a higher rate of marijuana use in the US. This is kind of, part of the culture, but they were usually 8% above, 10% above the national average, now 30% above. So, Colorado, driving fatalities. Every single category of driving fatalities have gone down in Colorado. Texting, alcohol, distracted, all down, except for one category, marijuana. So again, the issue is the increased ER admissions. Oh, by the way, kids under 10 years old getting a hold of a marijuana brownie with 30% THC in it, good luck. That little brain never been exposed to that. There have been those ER admissions for those kids. Well, how did they get it? Why would anybody give it to them? Legalization advocates say we would never do that. Yeah, they're right, they would never. But when you have increased normalization and you have this set of brownies here and that set of brownies there, and you grab one of them on your way to school because it's your birthday, well, you might grab the wrong one. That's what happened in one case. So, diversion, there's been really poor regulation, that they've audited, the states can't handle this kind of regulation, in other words. I'm gonna go quickly, very fast. The regulations are supposed to be implementing are responsible, yet they allow THC candies shaped in cartoon characters for kids. They allow advertising. They allow advertising on the internet, but they said, well, only the advertising on TV and print can only be limited to youth if 30% of your audience is youth. Who determines the 30%? The industry. And no limits on internet advertising. Tell me what 15-year-old watches television on a regular TV. You can't limit it. You have a First Amendment that says free speech. Commercial speech is free speech. Good luck trying to limit it. Because I hear from a lot of people, well, can't we do better? Can't we make it legalization responsible? We can kind of control it and sort of put regulations. No, the answer is that's very, very hard to do. California is certainly being targeted. I'm going to end with, again, I don't think our choices are legalization versus prohibition. That is why Patrick and I started Project SAM. The heads of most public health associations, many of them at least serve on our board. They've decided they want to get the public health messages out to people because of really this total disconnect about the real effects versus what people think the effects are. And we really have 4 pillars, which I'll end with, and maybe we'll have time for 1 or 2 questions. One is to inform the public about the science about marijuana, today's marijuana, right? It's not the marijuana of the 60s. Second, and this is important, we do need to have an honest conversation about any negative impacts our current marijuana policy is having. What is the impact in disproportionate, in communities of color? How can we fix our policy? We should always aim to improve our policy. It's not stagnant. But what we don't want, which is the third pillar, is the new big marijuana industry, which is essentially what we're going to get with full legalization. And finally, we want to be adults about medical marijuana. Let's get the research. Let's look at this from a normal point of view and that's normal with an A, of not thinking of this as having to be outside the pharmacy system so that people know what they're actually getting, that we can be compassionate for people now by starting a research program and enrolling them today in that to get these products. Let's do that without creating, the rent-a-docs and the pot docs and everybody else on Venice Beach profiting off of people's compassion. I really think we can do better. So we're a national group with state and local partners, and we really invite anybody to join us around the country talking about this. I know our time is limited. We might have time for 1 or 2 questions. One, I'm told, so make sure it's a good one. But please email me, kevin@learnaboutsam.org, if you have a question, if you have a critical comment, that's good. If you have a suggestion or you want to get involved, because we do need your voices. We have materials, by the way, you can use. And we want to change the conversation from the bumper sticker conversation to one based on evidence, really for the sake of our kids in the future. So thank you very much for listening to me. So I'm very happy to take one, or if it's a short one, we can fit in another one. Yes?
What have you found about continuation high school, which is a unique category in our educational framework when it comes to this problem?
Well, talking to people involved in continuation high schools is that, that the problems are even exacerbated in terms of marijuana, and that the perception, again, especially if folks in their family are using, et cetera, they don't think it's a problem. They're using it under the guise of medicine. And again, they see that what's the big deal? These successful people or people that really aren't down and out are using. Why is this a problem? And again, I think we just need to stick to the science, stick to the statistics, and show, look, you might get away with it, but it's going to reduce your chances. You're already behind. So good luck when you apply for that job, when you're competing against others in that workforce. So I found that really trying to use some of those stats about the future and jobs and occupations and school attainment has been successful. Quick one? Yeah, this will be available. Actually, this is already on our website. That was a question. If you go to learnaboutsam.org, which is right there, under PowerPoints, we have a plethora of talking points, fact sheets, scientific statements. If you go under PowerPoints, this actually is the first one there. So again, you've been a wonderful audience. Good luck. Thank you for what you all do. Thank you. Thanks for having me.